Hi there, welcome to the eLearning Champion Pod presented by Comlab India. I'm Shalini, your host for today, and I'm very thrilled to introduce our speaker, Tom Kuhlmann. Tom Kuhlmann is a chief learning architect at Articulate, a leading provider of e-learning software. With over 25 years of experience in the training and e-learning industry, Tom has worked with organizations of all sizes, ranging from one-man teams to large international corporations. An award winning expert, Tom is renowned for his practical approach to course design, and he shares his valuable insights and tips with over 150,000 weekly readers through his popular Rapid e-learning blog. And Tom's deep knowledge and accessible style have made him a trusted voice in the field, helping countless professionals create effective and engaging e-learning experiences. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to this discussion.
Thank you. And I'd like to just kickstart the session with a quick question. What got you hooked on to e-learning in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. Years ago, I wanted to be one of those MTV music video directors, right? Like all the young people back then. And so I went to media program, and unfortunately, they don't hire people without talent. No, no. So anyway, I it was a challenge to get into that type of industry, but fortunately, I ended up getting into doing multimedia development for this community healthcare organization, and I ended up working a lot with the training group, and eventually ended up in the education department there. And then I was doing, all the multimedia development, and this was years ago, so we were doing like PowerPoint slide
Right.
conversions to 35 millimeter slideshows, and computers were just kind of becoming a more mainstream thing in the work environment. And I realized that when I was sitting there in this training environment, I actually enjoyed training more than the multimedia work. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a nurse, so I wasn't going to get a job doing training in that environment. But what I did is I started looking for different ways to, like, like back then it was like monster.com and some of these job boards. And so I downloaded like every single training related job. And then I made a list of like what they were looking for and then what skills I had. And then I, just went and volunteered, did anything I could do to get the experience to do that. Ended up getting a job, working in the training field. And then because of my multimedia background, um, I was the one who was always kind of pushed into the technical side because a lot of the trainers are trainers because they like talking and sharing and teaching. And the
Right.
technology stuff was relatively new. And back then, you didn't have these easy to use tools like we have today. And so a lot of people who were trainers really didn't want to become programmers, right? They didn't want that. They didn't want that technical part of, their skill set. And because I had the multimedia thing, and I always liked it, I kind of was always forced into that first, right? And I always wanted to do the facilitation. But then as the industry grew, my skill set was growing with it. Then I kind of ended up in e-learning that way through my failed video director experience stuff. And then into, having these technical skills and then working in the training industry as this e-learning industry was starting to kind of take off.
Right. Thank you, Tom. That was a very interesting career trajectory. And in a sense, I think I'm safe in saying you're one of the rock stars of e-learning. So there is some MTV connection
I'm
yet.
one of the aging rock stars of e-learning.
They're the best.
Yeah.
So let me dive into this questions for today. The first one
All right.
is, can you discuss the importance? Can you share something about the importance of aligning learning and development initiatives with organizational goals and priorities?
Yeah, this is really the challenge for a lot of training people. I used to always joke, we had this thing, if in people who do training understand what backwards design is. But we used to call that bullseye design because what training teams generally do is it's like they shoot an arrow and then it goes somewhere. And then at the end of the year, they're like, oh, we need to tell the company about our return on investment, our ROI, right? So then they run out and find the arrow, and then they draw a bullseye around it and say, hey, look at what we did, right? And so we would use that to kind of teach a backwards design to training. And I think the reality for the training industry, and this is e-learning and training in general, is if you go to an organization and you say to the organization, how do you measure success? The organization, assuming it's a for-profit business, right? The organization says, well, we sell X number of widgets, or we made, $10 million, or whatever. The reason that organization exists, they have this measure of success. This is how we know we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. But if you ask the training team, how do you measure success? The training team will say, well, we delivered so many courses. We had 10,000 people go through the courses. There's a big disconnect between how training measures success and how the organization measures success.
Right.
And I think that becomes a big issue then in the training field, right? And so I think, when I look at like the importance of aligning the goals, I think the first thing from a training perspective is to understand what type of training you build. Because you have like what I would call is information or explainer type training, a lot of compliance training, those things. Compliance training is important, right? But those are not things that drive the business's success, other than
Right.
maybe not getting involved in lawsuits, right? And so you've got that type of training, and then you've got performance-based training. And performance-based training is the training that's aligned to what the organization's trying to do. I
Right.
think it's important that the training teams get a seat at the table, and they kind of become performance consultants to the organization. And then they're able to say, here are your goals. Here's where training can make an impact, because not every issue is a training issue, right? Despite what
Right.
organizations often think. And then you're able to help align the training initiatives to what the organization's performance-based goals are. But again, I think it still starts with understanding that you have these two types of training. If you're in a training space where all you're doing is compliance training, it's a bit challenging to align with the organization's goals, because at that point, the organization's just saying, we've got this health and safety training, we've got, sexual harassment training, we've got these things. They're all good training initiatives, but that's just being pushed down to you, and it has little to do with what the organization's saying we need to do, from a performance-based perspective. So I think it's understanding that, and then on the performance side, the training team has to be more proactive in making sure that they're aligned with the organization, and then helping, through some sort of performance consulting, helping them make sure that the training initiatives are the right initiatives to help the organization be successful.
Right. Thanks, Tom. That was a very interesting analogy, of the bull's eye and drawing
Yeah.
lines around it, because I think that's what we end up doing a lot of times. And,
Yeah.
this focus on performance consulting, that is the key thing to driving business results, business outcomes. And
Yeah.
sometimes
I
we
think,
can,
yeah.
yeah, please go
No,
ahead.
no, I agree, because um, the challenge I think a lot of training groups have is that they're order takers. They kind of sit passively waiting for the organization to say, this is what we need. And it's tough, right? Because, I mean, your organization builds training for companies, right? So I think one of the challenges with people who are trainers inside an organization is the organization says, well, we're pushing training to you. But when the organization says we need training, when they recognize we have this performance need, often they don't go to those internal teams. They then go to the vendors and say, hey, can you build training for us? So the internal teams, there's something in there that you've got to be able to determine how to get in front of your own organization to demonstrate your skills and to be, a consultant to what the organization needs. I think that's was a challenge 30 years ago, and I think it's just an ongoing challenge in the training field, whether it's regular training or e-learning type training.
Right, right. And it is changing a little slowly,
Yeah,
but nevertheless, there is change in the air.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think even when it comes to vendors now, there's a more of a consultative role that vendors are playing. as opposed to just
Right.
being order takers.
Right.
Right.
Well, and that, yeah, and I think that's why organizations go to the vendors, because they also look to the vendors for the consulting, right? But
Right.
their internal teams, they don't do that. And so I think
Right.
that's the challenge the internal team has, is how do we become consultants to the organization rather than the organization going outside? I'm not trying to put your business out of work. Um, but
No, I didn't think you
but,
were.
but but that is the challenge. I think that's the real
Yeah.
challenge, is, and that's why I think these training teams are always like, how do I show my organization that that I have some value there, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Coming to the next question, what is your approach to designing and implementing effective learning and development programs within organizations? I mean, can you share some examples of some L&D initiatives that you've implemented in the past, which really delivered the kind of results you were wanting to achieve?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to me, whenever I don't get to do training the same way I did, now that I work at Articulate, but when I work with organizations, and still, when I work with some of our customers and kind of chat with them, and, I get a lot of emails asking, well, how should I do this? And um, I always say again, I look at what I'm building. Is it information? Is it performance? Information-based courses, those are ones you can get done a lot quicker and not spend a lot of resources on. Because the reality is, the organization's measurement for success for compliance type training is, did you take it, right? So
Right,
why are you building these big elaborate courses when the only thing the organization's looking at is, did you certify this, that you attended this course, right? So
right,
I would then I would develop the good course and the right course for that, but I would extend the least amount of resources to it, which would then free up your resources to really focus on the performance-based courses. On the performance-based courses, maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but I always say, when we build a course, how are we going to throw the person in the pool, right? Because when you're looking at changing a person's behavior or their performance or acquiring new skills, what you want them to do is do the things in the context of course that they would do on the job. So what are
right,
the scenarios where they would use this information? What are the decisions they have to make? They don't need 500 pages of content. What they need to do is to be put into situations where they start making decisions, and then you need to use that to build out the training. So I always think training becomes kind of the source of truth for the learning experience, right? So the training content you build, like what is it they need to learn, right? So that's what you're trying to get at. And then I always look at, like, what do they need to do to practice? Like, how do they do the activities? Well, how do they make the decisions? And then the other part of it is, like, how many times can they repeat that? I think back to years ago, I was working for this finance organization, and it was a remittance processing facility. So they printed up all the, like, credit card statements and that. So they printed up, I don't know, like 40 million credit card statements a month. And so, in this environment, they had these massive printers, when the rolls of paper were, 10 feet tall, and
right,
you'd have to roll them in with a forklift, and they hook them up. So you had to hook this printer up to this big assembly system, and then the paper would run through, and print it. And you're talking 40 million, so it's very fast. They have to cut the thing. So when you ran out of paper, you had to put a new roll of paper on there, and you had to line it up, and you had to cut it to make sure everything was perfectly aligned. Otherwise, all of those statements would be, the printing would be wrong. And so it was, you didn't want to mess it up because it cost a lot of money. And they would train people, and so a new person came on board, they wouldn't let them touch the printer. But every day the people who were working there were doing like 7 to 10 cuts. So that was 7 to 10 opportunities to practice. But the new people, they wouldn't let them come in there. Well, it didn't matter if you were new or if you were there 6 months. At some point, you had to learn it, right? It's not like you were performing surgery. You're just putting a printer on there. So if you were brand new, you learned it day one, or if you were there for 6 months, you still had to learn it, right? So there was no reason
right.
why being there 6 months longer was
Just
better than being brand new. But that's what they did, and then in that process, they scared everybody about working with this printer because you were going to mess it up, and the organization, everyone's going to be
Right.
unhappy. So when I was looking at the training, I thought, well, the thing is, again, you got to throw them in the pool. They've got to go do it. So teach them the truth, right? Teach them what they need to learn, and then give them as many opportunities to do that as possible. So in this context, it was a real work opportunity, real work environment. So anytime there was a real work environment, we try to slow it down to make it more like a lab. And then what we try to do is give them as many opportunities to practice it. So if they were doing 10 cuts a day, if you let them do that for a week, right, they'd have 50 to 70 cuts that they could do. By the end of the week, they were super experienced, right? But they held them back and waited for 6 months. So when we went in the program,
Right.
that's one of the things we looked at. It's like, well, let's get them on the printer right away, make it less
Right. Right.
intimidating. So we actually, to cover the intimidation, because these big machines, we actually built all of our e-learning to talk about the machines and all of that and the workflow processes. So they weren't in the work environment. They do the e-learning, and that was how they got the information. We made sure they were very comfortable with what the machine was and what it did.
Right. Right.
And then before they even did anything on the machines, we made them do the performance, the maintenance program. So every day you had to take stuff apart and clean it. So they
Right.
had to,
Right.
and they didn't like doing it, right? Because they wanted to do the work. But the first few days, all they did was clean the machine. It was almost like the Karate Kid movie. You had to wax on, wax off, all
Yeah.
that.
Right.
And I want to learn karate, but no, you're going to clean this car. But that's the same thing. Is they touched the machine, they took it apart. It had nothing to do with their work as far as their day-to-day thing. But by the time they actually did the cutting and stuff, they were so comfortable with the machine that they weren't intimidated, which really helped that. But I think, going back to the basics of it, it's throwing the person in the pool. Like, what do they need to do? Let's get them doing that as soon as we can, and then let them practice and repeat. And in the context of e-learning, what makes e-learning work really well is you can fail and it doesn't matter, right? You can mess
Right.
up. You're not destroying things. You can mess up. You can repeat. You can get feedback, and so a good training program does that. The other key thing, I think, which is going back to the way the organization works, is the managers need to manage. Like, a manager manages a person or a team of people. What generally happens in the organization, if I'm a manager and I have this person and they need to learn something, like even if it's the machine, or they need to learn how to run meetings, or they need to learn how to manage, what happens is they go to a training program, the trainers train them, and then they go back to work. But the manager's not training. Like, why isn't the manager in an organization more involved with the employees' training and the assessment of where that employee or that person's at in their training? Because often they get sent off somewhere. We see it all the time, right? You go to classes,
Right.
you take an e-learning course, you pass it, you come back to work, and your manager has no role in what you learned
Right.
and how to take what you learned and apply it. So I think that's an opportunity within an organization that could, going back to the earlier question, well, how do I know my training is aligned? Well, you're training, but the people who work with those people need to be better aligned to what training is happening, and how can they be participants in that training.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. That was a very interesting story. And you're right. E-learning gives you a very risk-free, a safe environment to fail and just get on with it.
Yeah,
And
if you build it that way, right?
yeah, if
Yeah.
yes. And what you mentioned about the role of the managers, I think that's another very important area because now there's an increased focus on equipping managers to be more supportive of their team's learning goals and
Right.
using touch points in the flow of work in their regular team meets to just touch upon some part of the learning process, perhaps just a Q&A, a 5-minute Q&A and so on, so that they play a more active and engaged role.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Tom, coming to technology, AI is the latest game changer, the hero that we need and probably deserve. So, how do you perceive the evolving landscape of learning and development in the context of these advancing AI tools and technologies? How do you see them shaping the future of workplace learning?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because one is it seems in a lot of ways AI seems kind of magical, right? Like especially when you first get in there and you think, whoa, this is just crazy. Like I use it all the time. I play around with AI image generators and do all sorts of things because I'm always intrigued. Like, what can I do? I'm not a graphic designer, so if I can use AI to create the custom graphics I need, that's important, right? Again, talking about the graphics, when you're an e-learning developer, and you see this with the Articulate tools too, when you're an e-learning developer, the tools may give you a lot of stock imagery, right? Or you go online, you find stock images. And stock images, how many characters do you need? 200? 10? I think, most times when you have stock imagery, you really only maybe need like 5 or 10 images.
Right.
What you really need is an image for your course. And the problem with stock images, and I see this all the time in our community, the problem with stock images is it's a stock image. And so, you are never going to get the exact image you need for your course. You don't have that context, right? So the stock image is going to be a basic character, right? And then so I need something very specific. And that's where the power of AI comes in, because AI can give you that specific. So when I'm playing with like the image generation tools on my own time, I'm always looking at like, well, if I had this type of course, how would I build this image, right? Because then with AI, I can prompt it and have it create things. So I think the AI, there's something magical about it. I think, what I see is over time, it's just there. I think it's going to be built into every single product, everything we use. I was joking about the other day with like, I bought a toaster, but I didn't buy an electric toaster, right? So nobody talks about electricity, but there was some point where houses didn't have electricity. And there's probably like that first house in a neighborhood that had electricity in it. I imagine everybody from the neighborhood came running over and was
Yes.
flicking light switch on and off. Oh, that's magical. We don't have to light candles, and and the wonder of that eventually just disappears because that technology is just ingrained in everything. So I think that's what we should expect with AI. It's just going to be ingrained in everything, and there's nothing magical and stuff. After a while, right, the wonder of it's just there, right? I think from
Right.
a course design thing, where I see it being disruptive in our industry, if you look at, there's always the negative and positives to it. I think if, again, we have all these courses like the information performance based courses. If you're doing a lot of information based courses like the compliance training, and those things are mostly content, right? AI is going to do all that. I just don't see where an organization's going to want you building a lot of custom content for uh, for those types of courses, because I can just see where, here's the company's policy, and then you have annual training, and just click a button, take training, and it just can generate on the fly, generate your courses, and build that stuff really easy, right? The performance-based stuff I think is a bit more challenging. So I think there'll be a shift in our industry, because if that's all you're building is this information type content, then AI is going to do most of that work for you. I
Right.
don't think though that means you're going to lose your job. I think what's going to happen is you're just going to have to do more of that type of work. Organizations say, oh, it used to take us, I think about like even way back before I joined Articulate, to build an e-learning course cost a lot of money, and you needed all this technical expertise, right? Like
Right.
Flash or Authorware or something. And then these PowerPoint to Flash tools came out, like, Articulate's Studio in the early days. Now all of a sudden, any organization could build e-learning. So that didn't mean every e-learning course was great, but every organization could build e-learning. And so it created more e-learning, and it created all this demand for e-learning, right? And then AI is just going to make it even easier, and it's going to create more demand. So I think it's just going to create more work, but I think that information driven content you're going to create a lot more, maybe with fewer people, just because it's so much
Right.
faster. The other part that's really interesting is the whole content, like the custom aspects. I was helping somebody who was doing like a active shooter training, like a safety training program, and you can't find uh, stock imagery for active shooter, things, right?
Right.
But but with AI, we were able to kind of play around and generate the type of
Right.
imagery that you needed for that very specific course. So I think, I see AI as like, this assistant that's working with you.
Absolutely.
You still are the person driving things, but it speeds up things. I'm excited about, like, on the Articulate side, we're playing around with a lot of AI. Well, you'll start to see that coming out here in the next few months.
Great.
Um, and it's nice, like, to me, there's some cool stuff, the novel cool stuff, but to me, the thing that's most exciting is creating the quiz questions, because everybody hates creating quiz questions. You know, asking the question is easy, finding the right answer is easy,
Distractors.
but creating three distractor parts of the question, nobody likes it. Subject matter experts don't like doing it. The e-learning developers don't like doing it. So those tedious things, and that you also have to have a lot of really good nuance to it. AI is great for that. So, being able to sit there and do that literally in minutes, and then you go through and edit it. But it's exciting. I think it'll disrupt how people do their work, but it's an exciting time.
Right. Right. Very true, Tom. And what you said about AI being a good assistant, I think
Yeah,
that's how we need to view it. And although a lot of things that are happening through AI, a couple of years back, they would have appeared to be in the realm of science fiction,
yeah,
including generating images, which are
yeah,
really fantastic. Thankfully, in corporate training, we are not called upon to create those kind of surreal kind of
right.
images and so on. But yes, it does give us a lot of scope to really add to the existing range of what we have, because stock images don't just do the job. And
Yeah,
I really like what you shared about, the information kind of content that can be very easily handled by using AI. But the
right.
performance consulting piece, where there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of consultative work which lays the groundwork for the upcoming learning initiative. That's where I think the role of the human is totally irreplaceable.
For now, I I
Yeah,
envision I envision at some point everything will AI will just exist and everything, right? So I envision that maybe I'm working, and let's think of AI, I have a partner, right? And I'm working, and as I'm working, the AI is able to analyze what I do and could say, hey, Tom, I noticed, let's say I'm building a PowerPoint slide. Hey, I noticed that you keep doing this to insert images. There's a shortcut. Let me show you, right? That you'd at some point, from the performance perspective, you'd have some sort of AI oversight that is assisting you as you work and could see what you're doing, how things could be more efficient, or this is, you know, like we make decisions at work, but we're not tied into everybody else who's making decisions, right? Or
right,
doing things.
right,
But AI, a system that's tied into everything, would know, oh, you're working on this, but Janice over in this department is working on the same thing, right? And let's get
right.
connected. Or, you keep making these mistakes, or this customer, we looked at your email. I mean, it sounds a bit dystopian, right? But we saw your email, and the customer actually wanted 100 of these, and you're only entering 10, right? I mean, those are those performance-based enhancements, right? So I think at some point, you know, you're getting this kind of training, in a sense, or the learning experience at the time that you need it, and it's
Need
kind of
it.
coaching you and helping you, making decisions, or making the right decisions, and coordinated with other things going on in your organization. I mean, it sounds a bit science fiction, but as fast as all this stuff is happening, um, I wouldn't doubt if, at some point, all these massive enterprise systems are all kind of tied into what you do and how you're learning and what the real needs are in the organization.
Right, right. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how this is going to play out. And
Yeah,
as you said, it's going to play a far more active role at your point of need, at the learner's point of need, and even at the L&D professional's point of need when they're
right.
crafting and designing these learning experiences. So Tom, you were mentioning something about, Articulate coming up with something in the near future, which is very exciting. So could you share something about, what are your favorite features? I know that Articulate always sets the bar very high with its emphasis on product innovation, and every new release brings exciting templates, exciting features. So, what are your favorites that have helped you craft memorable learning experiences?
Yeah, I think, one is I am not a programmer. I actually started as an Articulate customer, like years ago. This is when Articulate, nobody knew Articulate, right? And I actually was working for this group that uh, supported NGOs, so they didn't make any money, right? And so they were trying to get into e-learning to try to have some cost savings, but it was too expensive. And so I was out there looking for like different, like what technologies exist? Can we build Flash-based templates that they could use and all that? And I kind of stumbled upon Articulate had just come out with their first uh, presenter tool. This was way before Studio and Quizmaker and all of that. And it's like I was like, wait a second, I can take PowerPoint, and basically we're just taking PowerPoint and converting it to Flash, and then you put it in a player, right? I was really building Flash content in PowerPoint, and it was just mind blowing to me, kind of like the AI stuff, right? It seems simple because a lot of people back then in the training industry were very anti PowerPoint, and so if you told them, hey, we're going to build something with PowerPoint and make that our e-learning courses, everybody said, that's
Yeah.
stupid. Why would we do that, right? And a lot of the thought leaders in our industry thought that for a while. But I kind of saw that, and and this kind of goes to what I think is my favorite feature or functionality of Articulate. It's the tools work for everybody, right? Like before Articulate Studio came out and kind of I think drove the industry and the simplicity. It was expensive to get into e-learning. Like if I had a small organization, there was no way I was going to build an
Right,
e-learning course.
right,
Those places, or if I was like, I have a friend who's a sales manager and he's got to train some salespeople. He's not a trainer. The
right,
idea that he would have hired a Flash developer and built these expensive courses, that
right.
wouldn't have happened. He was
Yeah.
still building training. He was building it in Word docs. He was building it in PowerPoint, right? So it's not like the training wasn't being built. But what happened was these tools like Articulate Studio enabled everybody to build tools. It democratized that. It opened opportunities for everybody. And I think created opportunities for all sorts of vendors and people to come in and start building e-learning that may not have had those opportunities when they were just doing Flash development.
Right,
But now
right,
all of a sudden everybody could do e-learning. Everybody's thinking about doing e-learning. And that then now what I think is years ago when you talked about how to build good e-learning, it was always focused on the technology, like how do we get on the server? How do we get the program
right.
stuff to work? And now because everybody can build it, the conversation is how do I build good e-learning, right? Because
Right.
there's obviously everybody jumping in building e-learning. You're not always getting the best e-learning courses. But I
Right.
think to me that as a feature, Articulate opening the door. The other thing that I like, I said we're doing a lot of things with AI. We're really, I think, taking a very nice measured approach to it. A lot of times there's like what I say is the AI gold rush, because you can go onto any of these things. There's like an AI tool wherever, right? People realize, oh, we can say AI, let's throw some junk together and sell it, and we'll make our money quickly and we'll leave, right?
Right.
And then you have all these fly by night AI things, or you have tools that integrate AI, and then what they did doesn't work 2 months later, or it's just like but they're not going to make the investment to keep doing it. So I think Articulate's taking I see this from behind the scenes. We're taking a nice measured approach, and we want to make sure that we're building the type of AI uh, assistance implementation that really is how the customers want to use those tools, right? And do it right. So you're going to start to see it roll out in pieces, hopefully in the next few weeks, maybe. Um, so I'm excited about that. To me, the absolute best part of Articulate isn't the technology per se, it's the support that our customers get. I say that, because I'm was involved in the development of our community. I've written
Right.
the blog for a long time. I'm in the community every day helping people because that helps me stay sharp on the tools and
Right.
stuff, and we do the training. But I think, when you buy any type of technology, even if it's an easy technology to use, a lot of times, especially in a lot of organizations, they get the technology and then that's it. But there's nobody in your organization that knows, the training teams generally are small. So who's going to help the trainer who's in an organization who doesn't know anything about how do
Right.
I get this thing done? Or how do I do this type of project, right? So when you buy Articulate, you're not just buying the tools, you're really buying into a whole ecosystem of customer support, a community. We have, a couple million members in our community. So at any given time, there's a few thousand people in the community helping each other out. I'm always amazed at the support. Like I'll see a question in the community, I go to build a quick tutorial, and by the time I've got the tutorial, like a 5-minute tutorial recorded and get it in there, there's already been like 3 or 4 answers. So
Right.
that, to me, as a feature, it's like you get the good tool, but you're getting this ongoing support from Articulate. You're not signing a contract and then the company's gone, right? Which happens a lot in
Right.
technology. You really, you really have a lot of support. I always tell my team, I don't know if you know what a post hole digger is, but it's one of those shovels, like the 2-handle shovel, and you throw it in the ground and you pull it apart and you dig holes, to put your fence posts in there. And I always say, Articulate sells a post hole digger. The customers build fences, right? So we need to help the customers build better fences. They just happen to be using our tools. And so that's kind of the focus we take. So when you buy our tools, we're not just going to show you how to use the tools. We're really committed to you being successful in your job. And I know it sounds kind of salesy, but I mean that really is Articulate. So when you buy the products, the features and the tools are pretty good, but you're getting more than just that, and you're getting a commitment to making sure you're going to be successful. We'll do whatever we can do to help you out.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And I think this is
Yeah.
totally in line with your passion for nurturing a community of practice, right? If
Yeah.
I recall, your research was on cultivating communities of practice through developing personal expertise.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. That's actually, it's interesting because we talked about how I started. I actually was sitting in an office reading Training Magazine when it was actually a magazine back then, right? And there was an article about social learning, and it was this guy Etienne Wanger, who writes a lot about communities of practice. And it was that article that I read about this. I think he was just releasing his shared expertise book or something like that. And that was the article that said, I want to be in training because this is exactly what I want to do. Then
right,
years later, I completely forgot about the article. Years later, I was working on my master's program. And then I thought, I want to do this. And there is Etienne Wanger's book, Communities of Practice. And I was like, well, this is the guy who was doing this work who got me into the industry. And then that's became the focus for my master's. And while I was doing my master's, I was trying to figure, well, how can I do my schoolwork while I'm at work, right? So then I did my thing was on communities of practice and expertise, right? And then I said, well, we have all these Articulate licenses, so I'm going to build out like some sort of community around Articulate. So then this way I can, I can do it for work, and then it's also my schoolwork. And so and through that's actually how I ended up getting hired by Articulate because of my work in the Articulate community as I was doing my research for my other
right.
things. So yeah, I do love that. I mean, I love helping people. I like, hopefully I'm not running on too long, but
No
one of
worries.
my favorite stories for me was when I first started Articulate, and we were, working on getting the blog, and the community was very, very small. So we were like, "Well, what can we do on the community side?" And I had gone to a conference, and they were doing one of those demo fest things where people would show off their work, right? And this was in the early days, so all the really cool courses, you didn't see them because they were behind firewalls, right? Big companies were building
Right.
these, $400,000 courses and all that. So I was really excited to see all the cool stuff that people are building. And I walk into the room, and there's this guy there, and in a suit, you kind of caught his eye, and I was like, oh, now I got to go talk to him. And he had this very basic course, right? It was just like, um, it was the worst, right? It was just a bad course. It wasn't, it was the opposite of everything I would tell people to do to build a course, and it was just,
Right.
information and all this stuff. And I kind of felt bad because as I was talking to him, his story was very interesting. So he was a sales guy. They needed to train people, and he was kind of curious about this e-learning thing. So he bought some product, and then he built this e-learning course, and he got this people trained and all this stuff. And I was like, as I stepped back, I was thinking, here's this guy who didn't know anything. He bought some e-learning tool, built a course. Wasn't the best course in the world, but he built a course. He got people trained, but they were successful. The organization got what they expected. They were so proud of the work he did. They paid for him to go to the conference to show off what he was doing. And then he was coming to the conference to learn from people like me who was looking at what he was doing in a very negative way. And then, I was working on how do we want to do things that articulate. And that really made me step back. And it was, it's a very humbling experience because I thought,
Right.
I want to help that guy, right? He's starting. I'm not going to blame him because his course isn't great. I'm not the person who should be telling him, oh, your course isn't good, and you shouldn't be doing e-learning. You're not qualified. All this stuff you hear in our industry. It's like, no, I want to be the guy who helps that person. If this is where
Right.
your course is today, what can I do to get you to have your course over here? How can I help you to build better learning experiences, right? That's and that then became my commitment in the blog, in the community. It's all about like, we're going to help you where you're at. We're not going to shame you because you're not building the best e-learning in the world. We're not going to write disparaging things about the state of the industry and all that type of stuff you see in our industry. This is
Right.
where you're at. This is the commitment your organization's made to you. And then this is what we're going to do to help you out.
Right. Yeah, Tom, I think that's really commendable, and your passion is contagious.
Yeah.
So, Tom, do you have any, I mean, would you like to share something with our listeners today who are L&D professionals on how to grow their career? Anything that you would recommend they do differently or start doing?
Yeah, I think, um, I'm in the e-learning space. So I'll kind of limit it to e-learning. But I think, with e-learning, uh, it's all about, can you do the job? And I think it's probably in training in general too, right? So I think you should always be working on having some sort of portfolio, right? And not just, oh, I have a portfolio, it's my kind of resume, but it's really like, it's my lab, right? I have skills, and I want to be able to showcase my skills. I see so many times in our industry where people build courses and they don't have a portfolio of the types of work they can do, and then they get laid off, and then they don't have access to the tools. So they can't then build examples of their work, and they don't have examples they can take because it was all proprietary. So I think it's like, come up with a list of things you think, like I did in the early days. Like, I went to look at what types of jobs were out there and what skills they were looking for, and I made a list, and then I think, what do I need to do? I think have a list of the experiences or skills that you think highlight what you are able to do and the things you want to do. And your portfolio is kind of like your lab, and you do work, and you have a place to showcase. Here's what I did. Here's why I did it. Here's the results and whatnot, right? But I think doing that, I think you look at athletes. Athletes a really good athlete, when you get to world class skills, those types of people, they're all very similar. They all have similar speed and capabilities. But what separates the really great ones from the ones that have all the same skills naturally, right? And so the great ones practice more.
Right.
They're more committed. Like if I'm a, I know, I'll say, let's say I'm a boxer, right? If I'm a boxer, I'm not stop boxing in my boxing match. I'm boxing every day, right?
Right.
And I'm
Right.
running and I'm doing other exercises and stuff like that. But if I'm an e-learning developer, I just do e-learning at work and then I go home. So I'm only doing the work I'm given to do and then I leave. But the work I'm given to do is really just one exercise. It's like just doing push-ups, but it's not jumping rope, it's not running, it's not doing other things. So I think you have to think of yourself that way. It's like, what are the exercises? What are the things I need to do to continually build my skill set? The other thing is, and I think this is super important, especially today. My kids who are in their 20s, they're looking for work, and then they're always complaining about, well, nobody contacted me, right? And I say, well, when I was a kid, when I was in my 20s and I wanted a job, you went to the business and you
Right.
applied for a job, right? They didn't really have online jobs. But because it required you having to have a resume and actually going somewhere, you might have only, when there was a job opening, you might have only had 10 people show up to go to for the job, right? But now everybody sits online. You go on LinkedIn, you say, oh, director of learning and development. I can do that job. Click, and now that job has 1,000 applicants, right? They may all be qualified. Some recruiter or HR person who has to weed through that is not going to look at 1,000 applicants. They're going to look
Right.
at 10 and everybody else is gone, right? And you might be the most qualified person, but nobody's even going to look at you. That's why it's so important to be connected to people. In the Articulate community, one of the best ways to connect, one is answering questions, right? Because you start answering questions, people see you as an expert, right? The people who do
Right.
those e-learning challenges in our community, um, they get a lot of exposure because you do the
Right.
challenge, you're showing the work you do, you're interacting with
Right.
other people. We promote them, it goes out to our mail list of hundreds of thousands of people. So we say, hey, here's a really good example. And then your work is shown out there. So then you're kind of building your brand and you're
Right.
building, you're more than a line on some recruiter's spreadsheet. You're
Right.
somebody that somebody
Right.
knows, right? And I think that's the important thing. It's like you've got to build your skills and figure out find the skills you want to build, but you've got to build your skills and continually do that. And I think you just need to be connected to other people in your industry, because when those jobs are there, they'll say, hey, I know this person, through LinkedIn, or I've met this person here, I've seen this person's work. And then you have an in, and you're going to circumvent that line of 1,000 people who may have the exact same skills you have, but they don't know anybody. I think, those old, you should have always been networking like in the old days, right? But today with the technology and stuff, I think it's just, you just got to be out there and have something to show that you're able to do something, and some goal that you're working towards.
Right. Right. Wow. Excellent suggestions, Tom. I really like the idea of building that portfolio. And I think you've given a lot of developers the platform to do precisely that,
Yeah,
really showcase their talent out there and, widen the reach.
right,
So,
right.
yeah, thank you so much for those really great suggestions. And I'm sure our listeners are inspired. And yeah, so I have some good news for our listeners today. We have Tom joining us again in our 3-day virtual community of practice event called Learn Flux. And we are very excited to have Tom join us as one of the keynote speakers. And we look forward to having our listeners register for this event as well. So do save your spot. This is a great chance to interact with thought leaders like Tom, business leaders, expert practitioners, network, collaborate, establish your brand, start sharing insights, start networking, and also give back to the community. So, Tom, I can't say how happy we are at Comlab India to have you back with us again. And thank you especially for today's session. It was very insightful, and I'm sure there are some actionable steps that our listeners can right away start taking, implementing. So it was a pleasure to have you, and your rich experience and those stories you shared really brought a lot of this alive. So, and thank you for graciously agreeing to be our speaker for today's podcast. It was a joy having you here.
Right. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting up with people in the virtual event that we
Oh,
have
yes.
that you're
Yes.
doing. Yep.
So, Tom, can you share something about your upcoming webinar at this 10th Gala edition of LearnFlux?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges e-learning developers have is, how to make their courses effective, right? Because, like as we talked earlier, there's a lot of like information or content-driven courses, right? And so that's not necessarily bad, but it's just understanding how that fits in the grand scheme of your whole training objective. So what I try to do is think, let's look at what we have, we'll break it into kind of three common segments, and then look at like how do we take those segments, and with the ultimate goal is how can you apply these new skills, and then we say, okay, if I'm in this segment, what do I need to do? If I'm in this segment, what do I need to do? So then you're not just looking at e-learning, and what you build with your courses, but it's like, how is what I'm building effective, right? And the organization has a goal. What's the measurable goal? This is what I'm stuck building, right? Maybe you're just building a lot of content, but then how do I bridge that gap? And so we'll kind of look at what I would say is a very simple model so that you're able to understand what you're building, or even communicate with your clients and say, well, if this is what you want me to build and this is where you want to be, here's this big gap. What are we going to do? Because you don't want to get the blame later when the training's not effective because this big gap wasn't filled. So we'll kind of, it's a simple model to kind of help you think through what you're building.
Right. Thanks. That sounds really exciting and looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom.
All right.
It is a pleasure meeting you. And
Yeah.
I sent you a LinkedIn invite, and I hope it doesn't get lost somewhere there.
Okay. Yeah. I'll look. I only go into LinkedIn maybe like once a week because there's too much
Right.
noise.
I know, I know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. If LinkedIn's become Facebook. I liked LinkedIn early because it was very businessy, right? And it's still like that, but now there's just so much
True,
noise,
true.
and it's like, why? And then a lot of people contact me through LinkedIn, and I don't see the messages sometimes for a while because
Right. I know, I
I just
know.
can't sit in there all the time. I don't know how people get their work done if they're in LinkedIn 24 hours a
Yeah.
day.
I'm just beginning to get active on LinkedIn,
Yeah,
actually. I'm
yeah,
not an active user at all, but
yeah,
started practicing what we are telling our
yeah.
listeners to do.
But, all right. Well, have a great weekend. It was a pleasure,
You.
and then I'll chat with you probably sometimes before that. I'm sure. Are you guys going to be at any of the conferences, the the ones coming up here, or like learning the
ATD.
Dev Learn and those ATD? You're going to be at ATD
Yes,
Ice?
ATD.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Aisha, I think once we set up, we get the details of our, the booth and the presentation. Probably Aisha will get back to you, Tom, regarding the ATD session meet. Okay?
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Have a great day. Enjoy
Have a
your
great
weekend.
weekend, Tom.
Have
All right.
a
Thank
good
Bye.
you.
weekend. Thank you
Bye.
both.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.